All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
As many of you know, my first love is foreign policy. The entire reason I'm interested in politics is because of 9/11 and opposition to the war in Iraq. It's my North Star. It always will be. It's the area where the individual actions of the president have the most impact, and conversely, where Washington groupthink is at its most powerful. There is no area of American politics that is driven more by elite consensus and impervious to democratic checks. That is why, despite his failure to actually deliver on any of it while in office, I thought Trump was so remarkable. He was so radically out of step with the American elite foreign policy consensus on Russia, China, North Korea, the general commitment to the neoliberal world order of the last 70 years. And like him or not, Trump injected a necessary and important dose of realism into Washington. But now that he is gone, nature is healing, and war by the establishment against some of the new ideas that he's brought in are ramping up. This one caught my eye. It was a very interesting story. Most of you would probably just scroll past it, but I found it profoundly important. Headline: A war over Russia has erupted at the Atlantic Council. If you're not familiar with the Atlantic Council, you should be. It's basically the embodiment of establishment foreign policy thinking in Washington. Every general, every secretary of state, who's who in American foreign policy, they go to speak, they're on panels. You can generally assume that the thoughts of their scholars together embody what mainstream positions are in American foreign policy. That's why this fight matters. It's a proxy for the fight between the old thinking and the new. Now, the fight began with a pretty benign post that was written by two new experts at the Atlantic Council titled, quote, Reality check, number 4, focus on interests, not on human rights with Russia. The basic crux of the argument was that while the arrest of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny is bad, that the U.S. should instead focus, instead of putting sanctions on officials, try minimizing their use and looking for incentives that might induce Moscow to take steps more in line with U.S. interests. I mean, that seems pretty reasonable to me, that the U.S. should focus less on fake democracy promotion, which isn't going to work, and should try a different tactic with Russia. Seems pretty fine. If you were to condense Trump's position in 2016 into something coherent, that's basically what it was. But oh man, did these two kick the hornet's nest. After the publication of that report, 22 staffers at that think tank, including some of their most high-profile scholars, wrote, quote, their article is premised on a false assumption that human rights and national interests are wholly separate, and that U.S. policy towards Russia was and remains driven by human rights concerns principally. But what they did next was plain dirty. Many of the scholars pointed to the fact that billionaire Charles Koch, a longtime libertarian and advocate of restraint, had donated money to the center, which funded that scholar's paper. Now, writing, quote, the Koch network operates as a Trojan horse operation trying to destroy good institutions, and they have pretty much the same views as the Russians. There it is. The culmination of everything wrong with elite liberalism today. And leave it to them to make me defend the Koch brothers, who, by the way, I've been told basically have a hit out on me in D.C. for calling out their corruption of the American right. Just because the Koch brothers have funded it doesn't mean it's a bad idea. It's actually a pretty good idea. And maybe it's not 100% what we should do, but it is worthy of debate. And notice, too, that not only did they turn these completely reasonable scholars as agents of the nasty Koch brothers, they took it one step further, that they want to destroy institutions like the Russians. In essence, you're a Russian asset if you think that we should have a different approach if you don't adopt a hostile view towards Russia. Many of you were critical of us during the Trump presidency for constantly noting the media and elite Democratic obsession with Russiagate. This is why. Because when Russiagate at its core reinforced the idea that Russia, a dying petrostate, is a chief adversary of the United States, literally capable of swinging our elections, and worse, it granted all the license in the world to the folks who are outraged over at the Atlantic Council. From this point forward, if you propose having a different policy towards Russia, which doesn't implicitly say that the official policy of the United States should only be satisfied when Russia is a Western liberal democracy, then you're a Russian asset intent on destroying U.S. institutions. Truly, the worst part of all of this is that elite liberals have not only solidified their insanity within the American foreign policy community, but they have metastasized that disease to a large segment of the population. A recent Economist YouGov poll found that a plurality of Democrats see Russia as America's biggest threat, with 40% saying they're the number one enemy, as opposed to Republicans, who see America's biggest threat as China. A full 81% of Democrats said Russia is, quote, unfriendly or an enemy. Now, which do you think is a greater threat to U.S. interests? The world's number 2 economy with the intent and means to dominate the world's economic system through its exploitation of state capitalism, or the world's 11th economy with the dying population reliant almost entirely on oil and gas products, which happens to have nukes because they were once a worthy adversary? I'll let you decide. But the survey data itself shows the final victory for neocons in D.C. They were all but dead after their failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, and even after their response to the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2013. But Russiagate is the best thing that ever happened to them. And now that Trump is gone, they are going to use it for all they can, using their newly scared population and elite consensus to take America to a place it has no business or even a desire to do so. I think this fight really matters, Crystal, and I know it's like wonky and intra-DC, but the reason why is that even just having 2 people propose a very basic notion of, hey, maybe we should try something different. Hasn't been working. Russia's not turning into a Western liberal democracy anytime soon. Let's try something else. Oh my God. I mean, the freak out. They denounce them in their own pages. Talk about how they're Koch-funded assets, Russian assets. Think about this within the context of this new intelligence report about how Putin wanted, all this. And I see lies spread online about how Hunter Biden's laptop was confirmed by the intelligence community to be Russian disinformation. Not even true, but it is completely unquestioned, which is spread everywhere. This insanity has real consequences because it's used by people who want the, forever consensus on Russia and generally on neoliberalism to drown out any legitimate criticism of their own foreign policy. And this trickles up to the Biden White House. Biden today saying he's going to put sanctions on Russia exactly for election interference and all this other stuff. They already put sanctions on the Navalny. And I'm not even saying I'm necessarily against that. But if somebody wants to come to me, a respected person, and say, hey, sanctions don't work, Russia is not ever going to be Western liberal democracy, maybe we can pressure them in different ways or try engagement on something else, that's cool. Like, what's wrong with that?
Yeah, well,
and that alone was too much.
Not to mention that all the human rights talk is pretty much bullshit when you let them Saudi get away with murdering MBS and you don't do a damn thing about it. So,
great point. Yeah.
I mean, it's really what's shocking to see in that poll, those poll numbers that you pulled about how now Democrats, they say the number 1 adversary is Russia, is the way that the media has completely shifted the liberal mindset in a very short period of time. Remember back during the Obama-Romney contest when Romney made some similar comments about Russia?
Fun of him.
Obama mocked him. He was like, Russia, why are we worried about them? Like, their economy's a mess, etc. Everyone was making fun of Mitt Romney for obsessing over Russia, and they were correct. I mean, look, Russia can be a nefarious actor. They are trying to, mess with us, whatever. Yes. But to imagine that there's some world threat that we really have to keep our eye on as the number 1 issue facing us is really madness. And then it's also, it's very exposing. If you haven't been accused of being a Kremlin asset in the past 4 years, then you should be embarrassed because that is the go-to move. And it's so easy. And even these like grand poobahs of Washington who are so intellectual and high and mighty, et cetera, go to the same playbook of basically being like, oh, well, you all are useful idiots. You all are Kremlin assets. Remember when Hillary Clinton said that thing about Tulsi
for
Gabbard?
the same thing,
who
actually.
served the
Same
country.
reason.
I mean, again, it's just shows how this mindset and how quickly it's been completely solidified within Washington. And it really does do damage to both our foreign policy approach and also to our national discourse here, which has just become completely poison.
It is poison. And this was, like I said, if there was anything good about Trump, it was at least some of this bringing it and making these people in D.C. reckon. And now that he's gone, they are just full bore going again on Afghanistan, now on Russia. And we got to keep an eye on this because these are real ideas. Many Americans may even agree with them. And having them in the realm of debate is the very basics of what we could expect. And even that is just a bridge too far for many of these people. It's terrible.
Coming up, our panel with Michael Starr Hopkins and Marshall Kosloff when Rising continues.